So in Java, there is this reserved keyword called the super keyword. And essentially, these reserved keywords, when typed, sort of assume a tinge of purple. That is, if you're operating with the white version of Eclipse or your IDE. But in Eclipse, it turns purple to signify that these are one of the many reserved keywords which are supposed to be used in a certain scenario or for a certain purpose. And so we can't type these reserved keywords out as we would with any other textual word. And so the reserved keyword is very similar, that the purpose of the reserved keyword super is actually very similar to the this keyword, which we found sort of differentiates the class instance variables with some local variables that we may have in our method. So the super keyword, which like I said before, when typed turns purple, the super keyword, I'll use an example to sort of demonstrate why we may use the super keyword. So we could have um, we could have a class, let's say a person, and this in this scenario here, when you have a overarching class, in this case it's the person class, we often consider this to be the superclass. And as we make subclasses, we sort of specialize down. So a person is a very general term. It's often said to be the super term, and so when we make a subclass, which we could make an employee, we start getting a little more specific. And so with this relationship here, we have a person class, and as a child to the super person class, we have an employee class. And so this relationship here is really what is the basis upon which using the super keyword becomes apparent. So in the person class, we can have a string, let's say a name, and this of course would be an instance variable for this particular class. And we can do the same thing for an employee. And so now we have two names, one in a superclass and one in a child class. And so in normal cases, if I wanted to, I could make a void method, which could sort of be tasked with sort of displaying the name of the employee. And I'm going to say child name is name. And so at this point, I'm sort of referring to the name on the local level, not to be confused with what's in the superclass. And so going into my main method and sort of instantiating or making an instance of the employee class, I could make an object, or rather a reference to the collections methods and constructors, which are sort of found um, in my class. And so I can make an employee here. I can call him E equals new employee. And so essentially what this would do is it would allow me to sort of make let's see here, it would allow me to make a reference to, let's see, it would to the display method, which would actually just go back and refer, um, it would go back and refer to the display class, or rather these classes here for the employee, or this particular class for the employee, and go into the display method and sort of print out or execute the code which is confined in between those two braces. And so it does that, and it says the child name is Samir. But what if I wanted to sort of access, and this is really where the similarity or parallel between this keyword becomes apparent, because what if I wanted to access this particular variable of the superclass in my display function? Well, I could just print out as I usually would, and what I would do is, in order to make this distinction, is I would say super.name. And so what the super keyword does is it goes back and it searches for something called a name. And when it finds it, it will sort of make this applicable and sort of print out Monica. in conjunction to Samir, which is found on the local level. Now, essentially what's happening here is it's giving me a red underline with the name. And that's because it doesn't really have a super. Again, a super is sort of a super, this is the super class and this is the child class. And so we could type super, but it doesn't really know what to reference to, because this is supposed to be an inheritance relationship where the employee will sort of inherit the instance variables or anything that could be found in the person class. And so it's not inheriting what's in the person class until we put the extends keyword, um, which now makes it applicable, which now makes those constructors, methods, and variables on the found in the person class or the superclass available to what can be found in the or what can be accessed in the child class. And so we can say the super name is super.name. And so again, when we print this out, essentially the display not only includes what could be found in what is found in on the local level, but also sort of in another class, the superclass. And so this reference is essentially key in differentiating between variables. And that's why I drew a parallel between the this keyword, because the this keyword is also tasked with similar functionality in the sense that it distinguishes between these variables we find both on the local and global level. Although we won't call this the global level because we're not talking about one class, but we can instead call this sort of an inheritance relationship with which we can access. And so it's all about accessibility. Now, we can sort of do the same thing if we had, let's say, a display here. If we had a display for the person, so how, okay, so we've sort of, we've grabbed names from the class, the superclass, but can we also grab, let's see, can we also grab methods? And so to do that, essentially, I mean, we could just make we could make an instance of the person class, and we could call the display, which is sort of unique to the person. And essentially doing that would give us access to that particular block of code found within those braces. But can the employee access that display? That's the question. Can the employee access the display found in the person class? And so the way to do that is, and again, we don't want to use the person object or the person reference just because we want to have the employee access what is found on the super inside the superclass. And so the way to do that is we can create sort of another method, and we're not going to call it display. I mean, we can't call it display just because that would sort of lead into duplication. We already have a method with that name. And so we can call this the final display, so to speak. And so the final display will sort of include, what we can do here is we can just reference the display. And so when I type super, it now automatically judges whether or not something extends the employee class, which it does, and then it goes back into what extends the employee class. And then it checks if there is a method. I mean, it's sort of checking whether a method by the name display exists, and if it does, then it gives access to that block. And so now, sort of when I go back to E, and instead of saying display, whereas I'm mentioning this, here saying final display would sort of mention the display that we find in the superclass level, so to speak. This is the superclass. And just to access both methods, I could also access both methods. I could say display as well, and that would essentially give me those names found in the superclass as well as the methods that are found in the superclass. And so that is essentially, I mean, but if we didn't have this other method here and we were to look at this program, so to speak, and we were to say, well, there's a display here and there's a display here. When I do e.display, then essentially you could be confused as to what could be accessed. Could this be accessed, or could this be accessed? Well, E is sort of given the priority, that is to say the employee class, although it extends the person class is given priority over to what is found in the superclass, because that is what is sort of unique to it, and that is the closest block within which we are confined. And so that is sort of the implication behind the superclass. And that's why this and the super keywords are sort of very closely intertwined, but there are also super and this constructors, which sort of I'll go into in a later video.